Welcome to JMeter Academy lesson number 3. In the first two lessons you got an overview of the course, you installed JMeter in the JMeter Plugins Manager, and you built a fundamental test plan or script. Now we're going to go a little deeper and learn the pieces that add power to store, create, and move data around in JMeter. Here's an overview of what we'll cover in this session. First we'll talk about JMeter variables and functions, then we'll move on to JMeter properties. As we start this lesson, I'll give you a quick reminder that you want to install JMeter plugins from jmeterplugins.org. And for this lesson in particular, be sure to have the dummy sampler installed, as we'll be using that quite a bit in the examples. Let's start with variables and properties. JMeter has a few types of variables: user-defined variables, user parameters, functions, and variables defined in external scripts, such as a bean shell script. JMeter has three types of properties: system properties, JMeter properties, and user properties. JMeter variables can only be set within the test plan, while JMeter properties can be set inside or outside the test plan. For example, you can set a property in the command line or by passing a properties file to JMeter when you run it. User-defined variables are constants. They are a kind of static variable. They are initialized at the start of the test plan and can't be changed as the test runs. User-defined variables can be declared in two places in test plans. First, they can be defined in the test plan configuration screen's user-defined variables section. Second, they can be defined in the user-defined variables config element. The reason for this second approach will make more sense after we talk about scoping rules. Let's create a simple JMeter script and see how these types of JMeter variables can be declared and used in a script. Let's add a variable here by clicking Add and then giving it a variable name test server URL. Now let's initialize it with some value, for example www.example.com. Then let's add a thread group, and under the thread group let's add a dummy sampler. In the dummy sampler response field, I'll refer to the declared variable test server. Remember, it was test server URL, right? So let's put that in the response data. Variables in JMeter start with a $sign and are contained in curly braces. Let's put test server URL in there. Now we're ready to go. So now let's go ahead and add a view tree result listener. Okay, and then we'll save the file and we'll run it and see what happens. Here we can see that the response data indeed is www.example.com. So the variable we put in there was expanded and output as a response for the dummy sampler. Let's add the user-defined variable config element to our simple script and add a variable to it. Right-click on the test plan, choose Add, Config Element, User-Defined Variables. Now let's click Add, and then we'll put in a variable with the name test_var and give it a value of test_var0. Then let's refer to this variable name in the response data field of the dummy sampler. Just add that here. Remember, $sign and curly braces and test_var in the middle there. Now remember, here's where we set it in user-defined variables. And then let's go ahead, and there's where we're going to print it out in the response date, right? Let's go ahead and save this and run it, and then have a look at the view results tree to see the result. And there we can see it printed out. The user-defined variables declared in the test plan object are a kind of global variable. They can be used everywhere in the script. Now conversely, the variables defined in the user-defined variables config element have scoping dependencies. So where they are will affect where they can be seen. So for instance, if I move this up here, it has the same effect as if the variables were defined in the test plan itself. It affects the entire test plan. But if I move it down under the thread group here, the scope of the variable only will let it be seen by items in that thread group. So this is where we'll talk about scoping later, but you can see that right now, these variables would only be seen within that thread group, not the rest of the test plan. The advantage of user-defined variables is that they provide one place to set a constant value that all threads will use. There are cases, however, when you want a separate value for each thread. That's the use case for user parameters. Let's have a closer look at user parameters. So let's right-click on thread group and add preprocessor and choose user parameters. This panel allows you to specify a series of values for any user variable. For each thread, the variable will be assigned with one of the values from the series in sequence. If there are more threads than values, the values get reused. For example, let's add two different variables to the user parameters. First, I click on the Add Variable button, and then I click on the Add User button. So I'll have two users there. Now I'm going to specify the variable name. We'll call this one upvar. Now I'm going to use the function helper dialog to build a function to generate a random number for each of these values. So we'll choose options, function helper, and then I've built up a function here. I'll copy and paste it into each of the two fields here. Now we're set. Now let's change the number of threads so that each thread will use its own user variable. I want to make sure that's set at 2. I might already have it that way, but let's check. Yeah, so we want to make sure this is set at 2. That way we're going to go through it twice. We want to print this out somewhere, so let's go back to the dummy sampler and use the request data field to put them here. So we'll go ahead and put the user parameter in here, the variable we used. And we're good to go. We'll save the test plan and clear the results and run it. And we can see that for the first one, the value was 52. And the second time it ran, the value was 73. So we got two different random values, just as we expected. So remember earlier we said one of the big differences between user parameters and user-defined variables was how often they're referenced or set for values. The user-defined variables here are set only once, but the user parameters here are set each time the script runs through that point. So anytime the thread makes a reference there, they're going to get a new value. Whereas user-defined variables stay static. These variables here up in the test plan, same thing. They stay static during the whole test run. Let's take a closer look at the user parameters dialog and notice this update once per iteration checkbox. So this actually controls how often the values are updated. If you leave the checkbox unchecked, then the parameters are updated with every sampler request made within the scope. So anytime that's red, it gets updated. If you check the box, then the values are only updated once per iteration of that thread group. Let's add a second dummy sampler to see this in practice. We'll right click and do add sampler, dummy sampler, and then we'll call this one dummy sampler 2. And then let's take that request data field and put the same variable defined in the user parameters to the dummy sampler request field here. upvar. Okay, and we'll move this up here right next to the dummy sampler just for readability. We'll save it, and then let's clean up the view results tree and run it. Okay, so we've iterated twice through each of the two dummy samplers, and notice that each of the times the number is different. So if we check the box and run it again, let's clear our results here and run it again. Now watch what happens. So the two different samplers got the same value, right? And then on the second iteration through the thread group, you have a different value. So what happened was the value was only updated as we went through the thread group a second time. So there were two requests made, they both got the same value, then the iteration was made through the thread group and they got new values. Hopefully you can see the difference there now. Let's talk about JMeter functions in a little more detail now. We use the JMeter function, the random function, in our demo script. JMeter functions are operations performed on JMeter variables and constants. The function result is a value that can be passed to any element of a JMeter test plan. They're kind of a variable and have a similar notation to JMeter variables, except that the function name is preceded by 2 underscores. Remember the function helper dialog we saw earlier? Remember it because it's a very handy way to quickly get valid syntax, and then you can copy and paste the result into your test plan when you've got it. One last thing we should probably mention about JMeter functions and how they differ from user-defined variables is that JMeter functions are evaluated every time they are called. Remember that user-defined variables are static. The last type of variables we will mention here are the variables used within Bean Shell scripts, JavaScript, or Groovy scripts. Scripts written in these languages are used in JSR 223 preprocessors, postprocessors, timers, listeners, and assertions. The thing to remember is that they are regular variables of the programming language, and they can be accessed only from within the context of the individual script they are running in. To persist the values and pass them back into your test plan, you'll need to write them to a JMeter property. We'll cover JMeter properties next. Let's move on to JMeter properties. JMeter properties are global and can be defined outside the test plan. Properties control various aspects of the behavior of JMeter and can be accessed and manipulated by elements of your test plan. There are 3 types of JMeter properties: system properties, JMeter properties, and user properties. Let's print out the system properties. We can do this by adding a debug sampler to the test plan. And then we'll configure it to just print out system properties. Let's change this to true. Change this one over here to false. Okay, that should do it. And now we just need to save our test plan and run it. And if we go to the debug sampler at the response data, there you have. There's all the system properties. So these are all the properties that are kind of inherent to Java for the most part. JMeter is a pure Java application, and it inherits all of these values. And here you can see them here. JMeter provides a file which you can use to override these properties. So if you look, the system properties file in the install directory. These are the Java system properties you can override if needed. And what you would do here is uncomment a line or add a string to here, and then be sure to quit and restart JMeter for it to take effect. JMeter properties are similar to the system properties and are used to pass data between thread groups or to store something more permanent where JMeter variables cannot be used. Predefined JMeter properties are defined in the JMeter properties file, which is stored in the same location as system properties, your install bin directory. Let's open that file. Here it is. We can see that the JMeter properties are grouped into categories. Many are commented out. We'll talk about the best practice for making changes in a minute. For now, let's use the debug sampler to view the properties that are active. We just go back into the debug sampler here and change the system properties to false and the JMeter properties to true, and run it again. Let's clean it up and run it. And now if we look, we can see the active JMeter properties. Here's the list of JMeter properties. Almost any area of JMeter application can be controlled by JMeter properties: appearance, timestamps, log levels, output file formats, and even low-level parameters like HTTP clients, timeouts, bind addresses used for different network protocols, etc. It's a good practice to set new and override existing JMeter properties in the user properties file, rather than editing the JMeter properties file itself. In other words, you should treat the JMeter properties file as if it were read-only and limit your new entries and overrides to the user properties file only. The user properties file is located in the same directory where the JMeter properties and systems properties files are located as well. Here's the user properties file. One more type of properties, the custom property file, can be passed to JMeter as a command line parameter. If such a file is passed to JMeter when it's started, it overwrites the default JMeter property file. It can be done this way. For example, we call JMeter from the command line and add the -p and the name of the custom property file. Of course, this file should exist and be located in the specified directory. Having so many property files, we need to describe priorities that these property files are applied. The first property file that is applied is the JMeter property file or custom property file that is passed on the command line. Then the user properties file is read, and then the system property file is read. Another way to change the JMeter properties is to use functions. The function p, properties, and set properties. Right? So here's set property, and there's property and underscore p. Underscore p is just short for properties. It's just a shorthand. You can use either one. Using these functions, it's possible to change some JMeter property or change data between threads to pass data back and forth. Let's create a simple demo test plan to demonstrate this. To the dummy test plan, let's add 2 thread groups. Thread groups will be launched consecutively. Then, let's add 1 dummy sampler to each thread group. Into the response field data of that first dummy sampler, let's add a set property function that sets some property. I'll open the function helper dialog and choose the set property function. And then let's give this property name test_var. And let's give the value test00. And I'll copy that out of the dialog and paste it into the response data field here. Okay, and let's do that again. Well, in this case, we're going to actually use the property to read property. And we'll type in the name of that property again, test_var. And we'll paste that in to the request data field for the second sampler. Now let's add a view tree listener, view results tree, save it, and run it, and see what happens. And we can see that the value was indeed passed from one thread group to the other. So notice those are 2 separate thread groups, and yet by using properties we're able to communicate across the 2 thread groups. Okay, that wraps it up for this session. Let's talk about what we covered today. So first we covered JMeter variables and functions, and we talked about user-defined variables, which are sort of a set once and use throughout the test plan kind of thing. We talked about user parameters, which can indeed be 1 per user. We talked about functions, which are reevaluated each time they're read. We talked about variables in Bean Shell and Groovy scripts, external scripts, and how they're really contained within their own language, and that there are ways to get information in and out of those scripts. But you shouldn't assume you can see a JMeter variable from within those scripts. Then we moved on to JMeter properties. The first thing we learned is that JMeter properties are the way to move data into a test plan from the outside, like a command line argument, and they're also the way to pass data from one thread group to another. Then we moved on and looked at the 3 properties files and learned that we should treat the JMeter properties file as a read-only file and use the user properties file as the place to set or override JMeter properties local to your usage. We wrapped up by looking at an example where we pass data from one thread group to another using properties. That's it for this module. We hope you found it informative and look forward to seeing you in session 4.